And just something that I've noticed, and I mean, I think many people have, just how ineffective these missile strikes are by the U.S., the ATACMS. They really haven't accomplished anything. The only thing
Right.
that it seems like they've done is, I mean, they killed a couple beachgoers and children on the beach in Crimea, when one was diverted. But
Right.
in terms of military strategic thing, it hasn't done anything.
Right. I
Whereas
think when they were first introduced, there were some strikes, that probably of that had a meaningful impact, a meaningful military impact. That maybe a radar installation was taken out or something like that. But it the Russians are very quick to establish what they call, I think, a profile of a new weapon, and they established that profile for the ATACMS. And now they've, for the last several months or year or so, they just really have done next to nothing.
right,
And that's just something I find it incredible. I mean, we see that, we knew that, we pointed that out. But you had all these Western leaders, Keir Starmer, is just so, they so insist on having this happen. You say, like, why? Because this does
right.
nothing, and I just don't. They just don't seem to understand it. I would think that these people should be much better informed than we are, but I think we are better informed than they are. I think they're surrounded by sycophants and they're in the middle of a spin machine, whatever, and they're also just so beholden to the narrative that they really can't think outside of it. They're ideological zealots, and so part of that is that, hey, we're the West. So the only reason that we can be losing this war is that we've shown too much restraint. So let's remove the restraints, and that's what we got to do. But they just obviously have no understanding of the technological limitations. I,
Or the,
we
the
know,
finite limitations of the number of missiles as well.
yeah, right. I mean, it just strikes me again and again. It's just like how ill-informed, how stupid these people are. Um, but those are the people leading the West.
Yeah, I mean, there was just so much hullabaloo about we need to get these ATACMS, Storm Shadows, Taurus. This will be a game
Right.
changer, and we really haven't seen anything since it's been removed, except
Right.
angering the Russians. But just 4 or 5 days ago, I saw a drone strike that Ukraine carried out and hit, from what I gathered, an oil refinery. And it looks like it
Uh-huh.
did some real damage.
Uh-huh.
And it's just so clear to me, like, these cheap drones
Right.
are way more effective than these super fancy, overpriced, expensive missile systems that we are providing, that there's so much pressure on these governments to allow them to happen when they don't have much of an effect, when actually it's just these little drones that, most of the
Right.
components, from my understanding, are all coming. China makes over 90% of the drones. I think
Yeah.
China actually recently introduced a ban on some components
Right.
to Ukraine. But I stand in this statement that I made a while ago. China has done more to help Ukraine's military industrial complex
Yeah.
than NATO and the United States, because the drones have been the most effective thing
Yeah.
that the Ukrainians had, and it's thanks to China that they're able to build these drones and to
Right.
make them.
Right.
So it's just mind-boggling to me that why this decision was made. The only logical conclusion that you can come to is that this was done for the sake of escalation and to give a hot steaming mess for Trump when he comes into office.
Right.
There's no other explanation, right?
Well,
I mean, if
I will say the same thing that I said about the Ukrainians and the terrorist attacks. Okay, part of it is, which is often the logic behind terrorism, is that we want to provoke an overreaction, right? And that undoubtedly is the way some of the Western leaders are looking at it. Or I can't say undoubtedly, but I think quite probably. But to assume that there's rationalities, like there's no other reason. He said, yeah, there is no other reason, but they still did it. There is no reason, really, to do it. But they did it. And I think it's just... again, I guess I'll go back to what we said several times, that they just don't have a plan B. And when these politicians, you would hope would just say, okay, well, plan A didn't work. We don't have a plan B. Let's just forget this whole enterprise. This was stupid. Let's admit it. But they never do that. And so they just double down. And they just, the idea is that we just need to throw more things at them. And then they, have some people, some military experts telling them, hey, this isn't going to work. But then others who are, the sycophants are telling them, yeah, do that. And that's what they listen to. That's what they want to believe. That's the reality they inhabit. And so they just do it. I think it's a mistake to always assume that there's rationality and there is some sort of great scheme behind it. I'm sure there is, there are people who are thinking that way, and that it is a deliberate attempt to provoke an overreaction. Some people really do want escalation, and that's what they're trying. But others are just acting, because they're politicians. They feel like they got to do something, and and somebody suggests something. This is what we got to do. Let's just do it. And they don't want to hear all those arguments about quantities and Russian air defense capabilities and so on. That's I don't need to hear that. I know we're the West, and we just gotta remove the shackles. We gotta throw aside the restraints, and then we'll win because we're the West.
Well, how long do you think that thinking will go on? It hasn't worked out at all.
Well, we've gone through this cycle many times. See, the thing is, nobody should be surprised by this. There's always a wonder weapon that's touted or increasingly celebrated, and then kind of develops its own faction behind it that starts to pressure the political leaders to use it. And we've gone through the cycle many times. And why? Because the previous wonder weapon always fails, and we've just seen this again and again and again. So right, it's just amazing to me that they're thinking, well, this wonder weapon will work, but they always think that way. And they will again. So this one will fail, is failing. And then they'll go to another one. Maybe it'll be the Taurus, for example. And then, again, the Taurus I think is a very effective missile with a longer range. And it could, especially initially, before the Russians build a profile on it, it might do some serious damage. But the Russians will manage it, and they will neutralize it like they have every other weapon. But they won't learn from it. Then it'll be the Tomahawk. And then, like we said, it may be you get talk, but it's from Macron especially about boots on the ground, but he's not having any success apparently. Even the polls say that I don't want to do this. But at that point, the pressure to do it may become overwhelming, because that's the logic, right? It's just like the only reason we're losing this war is that we've been too cautious. So let's throw caution to the winds and send in the troops, and that's maybe what we'll see at the end. Yeah, because I just, let's be honest, we've just gone through this so many times.
Right, but at each subsequent hype cycle, the hype is less, right? It is diminishing each one, right? There's a lot of hype in the beginning. People aren't so sure. Maybe Abrams tanks are going to make a difference, or the Leopard tanks, or whatever it is that we're sending over, the F-16s. And as each one fails to pan out, I imagine that there's less and less hype that's being able to be built up, and then it's
still pretty considerable. Like there was a lot of pressure from political leaders. Remember how eager Keir Starmer was to remove the restrictions on missiles into pre-2014 Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And he went there with Tony Blinken, who was also really eager. And these are the people that matter. It's not the public that matters. It's there's still, and obviously a very powerful faction. I say, the majority of the Western establishment that is just committed to each new wonder weapon.
Well, the public matters to some extent in that they will vote.
Well, especially when you get their boots on the ground. You're right.
Yeah. And even now, I think when I say the hype, sure, maybe within the political elite, they can continue to hype each other up about every single thing, and they're in their own little world. But I think there's becoming less and less hype amongst just the general population. Yeah. Like this isn't working. Why are we doing this? And then that should have repercussions. Hopefully, if democracy actually works, we should.
Well, we see in Germany, I think it has up to this point. It explains why Olaf Scholz, has the only one issue on which he has a backbone is the Taurus missile. You just saw him cave in on every other weapon system, but they came to the Taurus, and I think it was starting better than a year ago. The pressure started to build, and a lot of people quite reasonably predicted, he'll cave in on that too, but he hasn't. And I think just yesterday he restated no Taurus missiles. And I think the reason is that, well, he's hoping to somehow, I think, I'm sure it won't happen, to remain Chancellor of Germany, and he knows that 80% of the population is against it. So, and so that does matter, as somebody who's he's looking at his political chances and he's thinking, well, this may be the only way that I become reelected, is that enough people just don't want to risk having Merz, who's obviously gung ho about using the Taurus.